very, very important river. It has been part of a very, very important urbanization, the second urbanization in India, and is deeply venerated along with virtually every single other river in our country. We don't just have female rivers, by the way, we also have male rivers, and then they are also deities in their own right. A lot of natural caverns and grottos have over time been used by man and then reused as places of worship. You can take back human worship and sacredness in the caves and the caverns at least, if not earlier, to about 70,000 years ago. We have some very, very recent material from Southeast Asia, which has rock art, which goes back that far on cave walls. We also have a large number of beautifully painted caverns at Lascaux and Altamira and other sites in Europe. We have the absolutely amazing Bhimbetka caves, and you have a large number of such caves scattered across the length and breadth, which have been used and reused time and again as sacred spaces. There are very, very famous cave monasteries all over South Asia, which are Buddhist cave monasteries today. They have been used by various Brahmanical groups. They have been used by various Jain groups, but now almost all of them are only used by the Buddhists, who were some of the earliest of the modern faiths to start using them. We have, as I said, a large number of these um, sacred cave shrines. Some of the most interesting, as far as archaeologists are concerned, are cave shrines in Sri Lanka, where excavating the floors of these cave shrines, which are very often, semi built up inside and so on and so forth, we've realized that when we go beyond the layers of occupation that date to the Buddhist era, we find that these caves were used much, much earlier. And some of the earliest human remains from the Indian subcontinent of modern humans actually come from some of these caves, like Fahim Cave, Beli Lena, Batadomba Lena, and various other different cave sites. We also worship very interesting other elemental signs. This is, of course, the famous Amarnath Himling, or the shivling made of ice, which again only exists for a brief time. It is an iced, stalagmite, for lack of any other word to use, and is again a very, very important ritual center, a ritual space, and the end of a very hard pilgrimage. And that's what pilgrimages are, of course, supposed to be. And that once again is part of the nature of the sacred space, that it must be difficult to get to. There must be an effort involved in achieving your goal. And that is what proves how important the place is and the sacrifice that you have made is. And therefore, the value of the sacredness increases the more difficult it is to access. This is a very modern space. I'm using this as the represented example. This is a place known as the Gateway to Hell. And this is in Kazakhstan and is actually very modern. This is the site where a group of uh, Russian miners were drilling a well for natural gas, and they did not know that there was a large cavern underneath which collapsed. Nobody was really hurt, but the collapse continued for some time. It was a very deep cavern that collapsed, and a large amount of debris from the top collapsed onto it, creating this massive crater. They soon realized that there was a lot of gas being given out, and animals in the vicinity were dying due to methane gas. In 1971, when this happened, they decided to ignite the gas so that it would burn off in a few days and keep animals from dying. It has been burning for the last 50 years. Yep. And does not show any signs of abating and is a big tourist attraction. But there were many other locations like this, not as spectacular, not as large, especially in Azerbaijan and that region, where subsequently the drilling of oil wells and natural gas wells permanently disrupted the flow of natural vents that were a matter of great awe to our Chalcolithic and early historical brethren who could not believe that there was a place where fire emerged from stone without any fuel. And in Baku and other places, there were very well known shrines built around such fireplaces and were worshipped in very important sacred spaces. Two of them are still kept alive, and a wood-based fire is now lit in those locations because both closed up after recent tremors and shifting in the earth. We now come to built-up spaces. We've talked about natural spaces, and we are going to talk about built-up spaces and how built-up spaces too can be either very simply accessible or very difficult to access. So all religions and all faiths have different built-up spaces, and many of these are so specific in nature that they can be immediately identified. On the left-hand side is a very, very beautifully done Islamic shrine. On the right-hand side is a Shinto shrine. This, of course, is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is where, well, Jesus is supposed to have been buried before he rose from the dead. And this is one of the holiest, most contested places in the entire Christian world. This is the famous Tiger's Leap or Tiger's Nest monastery. And it's a very, very difficult trek. Today, it's much easier because access to the foot of the mountain is much easier. But originally, reaching the mountain was a great travel in itself. And then climbing up to this monastery was again a very difficult thing. So, telling you that if you wanted to achieve something, you had to pay a certain price for it. There are many such monasteries across the world. The one on the left is in Greece, the one on the right is in Burma, and they were built at some of the most inaccessible places. And I, as an archaeologist, I have just marveled at how they managed to get men and equipment up there to build the places that they built. This is one in China. It beats me why they even built this. I remember talking about this to my wife, and she said just to prove that they could, and that man could do, could surmount the difficulties that nature places in man's path. So yes, perhaps that is one answer too. Isolation is something that most monks of all faiths have craved. Most, repeat, not all, and therefore difficult to reach places are also selected, but not so difficult that the monks cannot receive regular supplies from well wishers. Please understand this. Almost without exception, all monks and nuns are parasites on society. They do not grow their own food. Yes, there are exceptions. There are the nice monks of Benedictine monasteries who make beautiful liqueurs like Benedictine, and the Trappist monks who make beautiful beers and so on and so forth. But those, as I said, are exceptions to the case. Various different religions have complex shrines. On the left-hand side is the Vadyaji Atashberam, one of the holiest shrines of the Zoroastrian faith in Mumbai, a very complex multi-story structure with, as Ramyar was saying yesterday, sacred space within space within space. So the entire premises is the space. Then as you enter, the opening leads you to a place of ablution, before which you need to, after which you can only proceed into the next space. And then there are spaces within that are only open to the ordained priest, not just the ordained members of the faith. And even within that, various different zones, which are only accessible to specifically ordained priests and not just all the ordained priests. Zoroastrianism also venerates the waters, and this is a very, very famous shrine, Bikhaberam's well, next to the old CTO. And this was venerated not just for its uh, life-giving waters and faith in the waters, etc., but because it actually saved Bombay at a critical juncture. In 1944, when the Bombay docks caught fire after the massive explosions of the HMS Strychnine, it was this well that was pumped non-stop for 7 days and 7 nights by the Bombay Fire Brigade. and it did not run dry. And please remember, when it was built in 1725, it was as an act of gratefulness, and it was on the edge of the island, almost at the seashore. There are various different semi-secular, semi-religious places. On the left-hand side is the famous Bazaar Gate uh, Parsi watchtower. It used to be a piao, and there was cool water available on two sides for animals and inside for human beings. Of course, sadly, it has been shut and is no longer used as a piao, though it has been very beautifully restored. If you do one of the other courses that we are hoping to see Ramesh leading, you will also find out about the most amazing inscriptions on this place in a script that is almost unknown in most of the world. On the right hand side is another very interesting Zoroastrian sacred space. This marks the arrival of the Zoroastrians at the site of their first landing on mainland India when they came as religious refugees. This is the Sanjan pillar. It commemorates their landing. By itself, it just commemorates an event. But the nature of the event is such that the arrival here and the acceptance of these refugees allowed these refugees to follow their own faith and to live within their own faith. And for this, every year, Zoroastrians gather here for a rather large event called the Sanjan Day. And throughout the year, Zoroastrians passing through, coming by, going on other pilgrimages will stop here to venerate this pillar. There are few places like the Kaaba. This is a very, very unique sacred space. If you would believe the Islamic scholars, this is the site of the first temple created by Adam when he asked God for a sign, and God sent down a blazing sign to him. And the stone, the holy stone inside the Kaaba, after which the Kaaba or the cube is named, is supposedly that stone. It is the holiest of the holies in the entire Islamic world. All Muslims, devout Muslims, are asked once in their lifetime to make the pilgrimage to the Kaaba and to perform what is called the Hajj. It is a very simple space that has become more and more complex over time. Um, the state of Saudi Arabia actually maintains the entire complex, and there is now an air conditioning under the floor so that when the Hajj takes place, since it's a lunar calendar and keeps shifting, when the Hajj takes place in summer, it is not too hot for the faithful to walk upon. So, yes, a lot of very interesting things go into manipulating our sacred spaces. And this is only a small part, actually, of the complete Hajj that is performed. And I'm sure you're going to hear more about it from speakers on the topic. These are the shrines of one of the youngest faiths in the world. This is the faith of the Baha'is, also an Abrahamic faith in many ways, that claims descent from the Abrahamic faiths and from Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism and many of the other faiths of West Asia. On the left hand side is the very famous Lotus Temple that we have at Delhi. On the bottom right is the earliest of the Baha'i temples. On the top is one of the more recent Baha'i temples. And you will notice this uh, semi dome like, semi hemispherical, yet open to the sky effect that is very, very well known in all of the shrines that we see. In fact, there is a very recent one that has been even more spectacular one, I think, that has been opened in New Guinea. And the Baha'is are again a very, very young faith, and they have a lot of young designs. They haven't yet locked in on any one kind of design, but well, a dome reaching out to the skies is now becoming more and more a symbol of the Baha'i faith. Before you had any of these structural temples of the kind, you had rock cut temples. And India is one of the most amazing places in the world for them. There are thousands of rock cut temples in India, more than 1,200 of them just in the state of Maharashtra. On the left hand side, you have the famous Buddhist rock cut Chaitya Hall at Karla. And seen below is the inside of the hall. It's a beautiful apsidal hall with a barrel vaulted roof. Many of the ribs are more than 2,000 years old. They're wooden ribs with painting on them, the beautifully carved pillars. Many of the pillars actually have small niches cut into them where the remains of various different important people were enshrined, making each of the pillars a Sharirika stupa. The umbrella on top is almost completely original wood that you see on top of the Harmika inside. And there are elaborate donor couples on various different animals that are depicted on the capitals of the pillars on both sides of this beautiful hall. On the right hand side, you have the next level of rock cut architecture. This is the Kailash temple. And believe you me, ladies and gentlemen, I could have just spent the entire lecture talking about just this one temple. It is perhaps one of the most spectacular temples ever built, not to mention it is a rock cut temple built out of living rock. And it is a structural temple to look at, but is actually a solid rock cut structure. So you actually don't work from the bottom up, but you work from the top down. So you actually carve it out from top down and then you embellish it from top down and so on and so forth. It is such a stupendous piece of architecture that most people are willing to believe that the Kailash temple was built by aliens and not by human beings. Because to believe that this is a 12 or 1300-year-old shrine from the Rashtrakuta era is something that people find impossible to wrap their heads around. And if you just do Kailash temple, ancient aliens, you will get, I mean, at last count, I think I stopped checking after 50,000 plus hits. So you'll get more than 50,000 hits on Google if you put in this query. But as I said, it is an exquisite, exquisite piece of architecture. And if you haven't seen it, you should definitely go and visit it once in your lifetime. Rock cut architecture continues in the south too. These are the famous Badami caves or the Vatapi caves, as the site was originally known, capital of the Badami Chalukyas. And there are a beautiful set of rock cut caves on the massif within their site itself and the fortifications above it, which you can see traces of. So you have a very secular structure on top, and you have very, very religious shrines below it, and of course, a city that's spread out around it, which of which there is very little left today. So all sacred spaces do not have to be enclosed. Many structural sacred spaces can also be open. This is the largest monolithic statue of the ancient world. This is the Bahubali statue at Shravana Benegola. There are amazing myths and there is an enormous amount of veneration. There are two beautiful hills here, Suryagiri and Chandragiri, facing each other. Chandragiri is even more sacred, perhaps in some ways, to the Jains because this is where Chandragupta Maurya, the first of the Mauryan emperors, came down and gave up his prana by committing Sallekhana. So that's why Chandragiri is very famous. And Suryagiri on this side, of course, has this amazing, amazing monolithic statue built in the Ganga Chalukya style. I mean, it's very difficult to put your fingers on art historically. On the right hand side, if you notice, you will see the worshipper being dwarfed truly just by the feet of Bahubali himself, where you're basically average human beings are a little longer than his toe. Okay, to give you perspective. There is a Mahamastaka Abhishek every year, and there are all kinds of the most amazing stories wrapped around it. Legend has it that this, so of course, historical fact, it was built by Chamunda Raya, who was chief minister to three Ganga emperors. And the inscription that you see on the right hand side of the gentleman in orange actually says Chamunda Raya Sa Karavilesa. This was built by Chamunda Raya, and it's the oldest Marathi inscription, uh, documented Marathi inscription anywhere in India. Uh, Legend has it that when Chamundaraya brought his emperor here to show him this amazing site that had been built, this temple, the sacred space, and from the profane, it was being turned into the sacred by Abhisheka, and a scaffolding had been built behind, very much like the scaffolding you see today, but of course built of bamboos and not metal poles. And there was an old lady standing there early in the morning with a small pot of milk to perform the Abhishek. So she was pushed to the side by the soldiers, and of course, the king was asked to perform the Abhishek. So, what has she been waiting for all night or whatever? So, the king poured gallons upon gallons upon gallons of milk and turmeric on Bahubali, and the Abhishek did not go below his chest, and everybody was shocked. There was something obviously wrong. All the people gathered there continued to pour whatever they had brought with them, and it just would not go below his chest. And the Abhishek seemed to be incomplete because the liquids of the Abhishek had not pooled at his feet. And then finally, because everybody had tried it, the old lady was told, well, what the hell, you might as well do it too. And she climbed up slowly the scaffold and poured her little kalasha of milk onto the head of Bahubali. And lo behold, the milk ran down his shoulders, down his chest, down his stomach, down his thighs, and all the way to his feet where it pooled. And when people looked up to look at this old lady, she was gone, adding to the mystique and adding to the sacredness. And the fact that Chamundaraya had felt that he had done such an amazing thing, and there was hubris, and that hubris needed to be broken. And that is why she was there to teach him a lesson. This is the most spectacular, perhaps, individual shrine anywhere in southern India. This is the Brihadishwara temple, built more than 1,000 years ago. It is the oldest such structure in granite anywhere on the planet. It is the oldest granite temple, the oldest stone temple built of granite anywhere that we know of. Very difficult to work, worked upon by the imperial Cholas, built here at the side of their capital, Thanjavur. And the Kalasha on the top weighs 80 tons. It is a single piece of stone and was brought by a ramp that was almost 4 kilometers long. Luckily for us, they only removed the first 2 kilometers of the ramp, and the last 2 kilometers were actually found by archaeologists. And we could then put to rest the fact as to how it had been done and that it was not the gods or ancient aliens who had moved the Kalasha on top of the Brihadeshwara. The Brihadishwara temple follows the classic lines of a temple. There is a central structure under which there is a Garbhagriha, in front of which there is a mandapa and other mandapas. And this is something that we first see actually amongst the Buddhists at Sanchi number 17. And we can beautifully trace it all the way here till we see its culmination happening in temples like Brihadishwara. This, of course, is the Kandarya Mahadeva temple, one of the absolute pinnacles of rock cut, of built architecture, perhaps anywhere in the world. Once again, entire series of chambers built to meet at the Garbhagriha in the center. So the Sanctum Sanctorum is in the center here under this beautiful Shikhara. It has a Pradakshina outside it. It has an entire set of sacred spaces. So the plinth is the first sacred space as such. In front of this, of course, is a Nandi Mandapa on that side, which is cut from this frame. So the entire podium, and on the other side, there is a Jagdamba temple. So the entire podium is the basic sacred space. It is within a set of temples, and therefore it is within a larger sacred space. Then, of course, you have the staircase from which you enter the Ardha Mandapa in the front. The next sacred space is the Natya Mandapa. Then there is the Mahamandapa. Then there is an Antarala, a kind of narthex which divides the Sanctum Sanctorum from the lay areas outside. And then there is the Pradakshina around the sanctum and the sanctum itself. So it is a very, very complex layering of spaces within spaces, as Ramesh was saying. And there's a multiplicity of concentric spaces or linear spaces with increasing amounts of sanctity and sacredness. This perhaps epitomizes it all. The picture on the left just cannot do justice to this amazing, amazing complex. It is not even a sacred structure any longer. It is beyond a sacred structure. It is a sacred complex. This is the Meenakshi Sundaresh, Meenakshi Sundaram, or just Meenakshi temple at in Tamil Nadu. This is the entire structure as such within which the temple rests. There are four main gopurams. This is the main gopuram over here, the Mahagopuram. And of course, you have the four main gopurams. Then you have an inner space within, which once again has four gopurams. And then you have another set of gopurams inside, demarcating this space over here. and the temple over here, inside the temple tank over here, the attendant temples over here, various different temple halls, various different eating places, various places for performing various ceremonies, scattered very, very specifically in the various directions, with a large number of pillared halls and smaller sacred spaces dividing up this entire complex. Outside this complex itself are the houses of the Brahmins. Those two are stacked in a certain order. So there is a very, very complex set of spaces, one within the other. You can see an oblique view on the top right hand side over here of the same temple complex. And you can see, as I said, the first ring of Gopurams, one, two, three, four, and the second ring, one, two, three, four, and then you have further Gopurams inside. So as you come down the main Gopuram from here, there is an entire space here with the ablution pond, etc. on the side. And then you enter this space over here, and there is its own pond over here again. And then you enter this space over here, and then further this space over here, and then towards the temple. This is a view of the Maha Gopuram over here. This is an older black and white picture, one of the first aerial pictures of the temple. And what you see here is the actual temple itself. This little shrine, right at the heart of this entire complex, is the temple, the most sacred of sacred spaces. Everything else is attendant to this in concentric circles. So Hinduism believes in the Vastu Purusha. It's a very, very complex process. It believes that every piece of land upon which you must build something has something called the Vastu, uh, and the structures that are erected upon them have to follow certain norms. So you have the temple as the body of a deity. It can be a standing body, it can be a sitting body, it can be a lying body, as you see on the right hand side, depending on how it is done. And if you look at the one on the bottom, you see the different chakras. So you have the Sahasrara chakra, the Aina, the Visuddha, the Anahata, the Manipura, the Sudhishta, and the Muladhara chakras. And these chakras, which are part of your yoga and yogic belief, ultimately are also part of the temple. And here, once again, the entire concept that I talked to you about the body itself being a temple and the temple being a body, and this whole thing coming full circle. Then there are personal sacred spaces. Personal sacred spaces can be of multiple kinds. Small altars inside a house, as you see on the top left hand side, a Deul Ghar, or a small home to the gods, an enclosed space built inside the house, which you see in the center, very commonly seen in a large number of places. Bengal, Bihar, the whole of North India will have these small rooms that are created in which the ritual, in front of which the rituals are carried out, and then the room is closed once again. So it creates a closed off space which is not desecrated by the profane. On the top right hand side, you have a typical shelf in a Parsi household where there is a small oil lamp burning called a Devo. You see on the left hand side, there is one that is about to go on. A new one has already been lit. Many houses will keep one going 24/7. Portraits of Zoroaster and various different people like Kukadaru and family members, etc., are all seen over here, as are the rosary, flowers, in this case, a very interesting set of Hindu icons, an image of Sai Baba, a Dhupdan, and religious scriptures. So the syncretic nature of this space is very obvious. On the bottom, you have a typical image that you will see in a Muslim house, which prohibits the building of shrines and the making of images, graven images. And you will see frames like this of important Islamic places. So that's a superimposition of the Kaaba and the Dome of the Rock at Jerusalem, if I'm not wrong. And there is a young girl offering namaz. This itself creates a specific nook. It gives you a place to turn towards while saying your prayers and aligns you on a sacred axis. And this is yet again one of the very interesting things that come up in sacred spaces again and again and again. the concept of a sacred axis. So all Muslims, wherever they are in the world, will turn towards Mecca and pray towards Mecca. And this is part of their faith. And this is a set of sacred axes which connects you to the most sacred place in your worship. There are, of course, portable places of worship. On the top left, you have a beautiful little portable shrine which could be carried with you, which has various different, very, very interesting avatars and things painted on the doors. There are multiple sets of doors. There are at least three sets of doors on this. And it's a very, very interesting traveling shrine concept. On the right hand side, you have a similar traveling shrine of the Christian faith. On the bottom left, you have the simplest of all traveling shrines, a sacred text. So, carrying your sacred text with you, and wherever you place it down, then becomes a sacred space. If it has a book rest like this, well and good. If it doesn't have one, you can put it on the sideboard. You will see this on a bedside drawer in every American hotel virtually. And there is an entire Bible Society that distributes these free. And you can even take it away and they will replace it very happily. Then there are a large number of public or open air spaces which are also sacred. They may or may not be directly or indirectly attached to sacred spaces. This is probably the largest sacred space on earth. This is the Kumbh Mela at Allahabad. I think this is Allahabad. Uh, Correct me if I'm wrong. Anybody who knows that I'm wrong, I'll be very, very happy to. Over 1 million people come here and congregate here for the Mahakumbh. And it is a huge event. And you have to uh, just give due credit to the local administration for managing to pull it off without thousands of dead. Um, it is part of the cyclic nature of Hinduism. It is part of the cycle of the Kumbh Melas and the Ardha Kumbh Melas that happen. And it is, of course, at the most sacred spot of the uniting of the three rivers, according to Hinduism, where the Ganga and the Yamuna meet. And supposedly the lost Saraswati comes up underground and meets the two. And this is the Triveni Sangam site. And as I said, over 1 million people congregate here. And then a few days after the Kumbh Mela is over, it is an empty part of the river banks once again. There are other spaces of similar natures. This is an Idgah ground or an Idgah wall on the top left-hand side. This is a very elaborate one, but they can be much simpler. They're simple rectangular walls with a central mihrab on one edge of a large open space, which is a public space. They are used for very specific prayers on very important days like Eid, when the entire Muslim population will congregate to offer prayers. The mosques will not be enough. And therefore, grounds like these, called Idgah grounds, with Idgah walls, as they were called, along one side, would be made. This is the very famous one from uh, Agra. On the right hand side, of course, you have St. Paul's, and you have the beautiful space in front of it, the circular place and the square that you have in front, which are very, very ordinary secular structures on most days, even though they are an extension of the Vatican City and the most important basilica in the Vatican City. But when the Pope gives an audience from this little balcony on the top, right here, this space becomes a very, very important sacred space where the faithful gather for his blessings and his Easter message and other messages from time to time. Alongside places where you go to offer worship are also sepulchral spaces, or spaces which are sacred and consecrated and which are very, very important for the disposal of the dead. Such spaces like this and congregations of monuments to the dead have occurred in India for the last 4,000 years or more. This is Rajan Kollur, dating back about 3,000, 3,200 years perhaps. This is a beautiful megalithic early Iron Age cemetery in Karnataka, very close to the Basavasagar Dam on the Narayanpur left bank canal. It's also a very important site of pilgrimage for a lot of archaeologists, because this is where the first scientific excavation in India was conducted by Colonel Meadows Taylor. who was the resident of the Shorapur Doab, uh, and was, well, not technically an archaeologist, but was a budding archaeologist at that time. Uh, these kinds of sepulchral monuments are seen across the length and breadth of peninsular India, usually occurring in large groups. I mean, again, this could be a lecture by itself, just talking about the sepulchral monuments and the non sepulchral monuments of the megalithic period. This is the single largest congregation of dead bodies on the planet. This is the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. This is where, uh, well, Jesus will ascend, or will rather descend and ascend at the end of time when the rapture comes. So it is the most sacred space for all Jews all over the world. And Jews have come here and have sent their bodies here to be buried for the last 3,000 years, if not more. Uh, to them, of course, it is not Jesus, but it's the second coming and the rapture. And this is a very, very important place. And there are thousands upon thousands of graves, most of them completely unmarked, all over the entire hill itself. Lots of religions practice inhumation or burial as a mode of disposal of the dead. Uh, Interestingly, all Jewish burials are with their feet pointing towards Jerusalem. So, very similar to the axis that I was talking to you about, the sacred axis. The sacred axis exists over here in death also for all those of the Jewish faith. For those of the Islamic faith, whereas the burial takes place in a north south manner, with the head usually towards the north, the face is always turned towards Mecca. So either east or west, depending on where you are buried. So that is also once again a axis that is created and which links you even after death, so that when the day of reckoning comes, when Qiyamah comes, you know, you will have your face towards the holiest of holy shrines. On the bottom left is my favorite cemetery in Bombay, perhaps. This is the Sivri Christian Cemetery, and it's very, very beautifully maintained and beautifully done up and cleaned. And there's some very interesting graves of some very important historical personalities. On the top right, you have a Japanese Shinto burial ground, inhumation ground. On the right-hand side bottom, you have the board of the Parsi Towers of Silence. I'm not going to get into this in more detail. I'm sure Ramyar will be discussing this with you tomorrow. Interestingly, while traditionally Christian burials were not to be disturbed ever, which they have to be now because we're running out of space to bury the dead, the Muslims coming in a little later after the Christians, about 600 years later, realized this was a problem and have dictated that after X number of years, the same spot must be used by somebody else. There must not be much more than a headstone. So traditional Islamic burials will not have more than a headstone at the graveyard. And even that will technically be a location which will be reused after some time. This is a typical burning heart. This is where the profane and the secular come together. It is a sacred space. You are born from the waters. When you die, your ashes are given back to the waters. For all the people of the Hindu faith and of the Buddhist faith in India, uh, cremation is the chosen form of disposal of the dead body, and the ashes and the remains are usually given to the waters, and flowing water is a very, very important criteria. So the location of the burning ghats themselves, the crematorium themselves, becomes, well, not a happy place, not a place of great joy, but a place where duties must be performed and a place where the departed must be given their final rites. And this itself is a very interesting kind of sacred space by itself. Many of these sacred spaces, even with the religious overtures, are very, very secular. This is the Commonwealth Graves Commission, which maintains graveyards and battlefield graveyards all over the world. This is the one at Kirki, the modern day town of Kharki. Very beautiful. I must have seen it hundreds of times as I motored down that road. Uh, their name liveth forevermore. And the Commonwealth Graves Commission makes sure that those who have not seen these people in their lifetimes, perhaps. Young children who were born and were very little when their fathers died are given a chance at some point or the other of their life to make the journey. And they come here, and well, it's a place of catharsis and a place where you can find closure. These are places of great veneration more than anything else. These are places when you come where you come together to mourn your colleagues, where you come to heal over the wounds of great sorrows and great pains of hardships of fighting together, and where people who've given their all for their nation, irrespective of whether what they were doing was right or wrong. You know, the famous lines, greater love hath no man than he who giveth his life for his fellow man. I think that's Kipling, if I'm not wrong. Ramesh will correct me. Um, these places are symbolically very, very important to all of us. Many of them do not even have necessary the remains of the dead. This is perhaps one of the most iconic sacred spaces in India, which is very, very secular in nature. An eternal flame burns in the center. The flags of the three services stand in front of it every day. This arc is very much like the Arc de Triomphe and other arcs, victory arcs of various sorts, has a beautiful uh, gun with a helmet over it, and is de facto the tomb of the unknown soldier as far as Indians are concerned. It is our greatest memorial to our war dead, those who gave their lives to protect the country that we live in today. And in that way is an incredibly secular place of deep veneration, and a very, very important place to members of the forces and their families, and to a lot of people in India. So there are many other types of sacred spaces. I could go on for the next couple of hours, but I think I will leave it here, and I will leave the experts to take you on the rest of the journey. Thank you very much to all of you all for listening to me. Thank you very much to the Asiatic Society for inviting me, and to Professor Nalwala and Ramesh and others who organized this. A very, very big thank you from me. If there are any questions, I'd love to take them if I can.
Thank you very much, sir. This was a truly enchanting lecture. I will ask Venkat to moderate the questions, please. Venkat?
Yes, Himanshu has a question. Sir, what could be the reason for creating Ajanta caves over that area?
What could be the reason for creating Ajanta caves over that area? So there are magnificent location, that beautiful horseshoe-shaped cut created by the Wagora River, where it has been cutting through the hill for all these years. It is also a very important site on a important trade route running through the Deccan, and it's a place which is a congregation of routes going north, south, and east, west in this area. So these are two of the reasons. The other reason is that the rock over there is of the right kind, more or less, to cut into to create these kind of rock cut shrines. And the final reason is that the polity that was paying for the cutting of these caves ruled over this area. So, as mundane as it sounds, these are the list of reasons why these caves exist where they are.
The next question is from Meena Paleja. The Jitabai well you said was built for tanks. Can you please elaborate?
So, the legend goes, and the legend, of course, contradicts in some ways the date that is on the beautiful stained glass of the canopy, which has come up very recently, rather in the last 100 years or so. The legend goes that there was one Bhikaji Beramji who came from Gujarat to Bombay to trade and was locked up for being a Mughal spy. And this was, in the time of turmoil after the death of Aurangzeb and all that, and things were not very, very good between the north and the south. So, as a Mughal spy, Bhikaji Beramji was locked up in a Karagraha. And investigations were carried out. It was found that no, he was genuinely a trader and not a spy. So Bhikaji Bairamji then came back, and in 1728, supposedly he built this well over here in Thanksgiving to say thank you to the people of Bombay and to the elements and the waters and so on and so forth. And therefore it is called Bhikha Bairam's well. So his name was Bhikha Bairam, Bhikha son of Bairam. And he came from Navsari according to the, well, the legend. It was a very simple well, and for a very long time, the well actually had a very interesting partition over the top, dividing it into two halves, and it was open to the public on one side and the Parsis on the other side. So the Parsis used half the well, and half the well was secular, and it was used by everybody. Then there were a series of vandalism incidents. The wall was raised around it, and the place was closed off by the Parsis. But before that, it was a place where a lot of people came together regularly.
Vishnu ma'am has a question. Where are the Baha'i temples located? One is the Lotus Temple in Delhi. Where are the other two?
So one of them is in the US. The other one, if I remember right, is the one in Australia. Just have to check with my records also. And there are Baha'i temples all over the world. The one on the bottom right is in the US and is the oldest known Baha'i temple, to the best of my knowledge, that has survived. They're very recent. The Baha'is are of the last century.
The next one is a compliment from Malika Patel. Thank you, sir, for the knowledge. This was enriching and something we don't find in books. The next question is from Himanshu. Sir, thank you for giving those reasons. What do you think about religious space of Angkor Wat, which is considered the largest Hindu temple outside India, if I'm not wrong?
Angkor Wat is not a Hindu temple. Angkor Wat, to the best of my knowledge, is a Buddhist temple. But it is an Indic temple. There are so many such shrines. There is Angkor Wat, there is Angkor Thom. So you have to understand that Angkor Wat is very rarely seen in its entirety. Angkor Wat is surrounded by water. There are two large barres, and there are pathways across the barres. So again, there is a secret space with water intervening in between, and the space itself is divided into a series of 4 shrines which are linked together by 4 walls with a central shrine in between them. So once again, there are at least 6 or 7 different spaces that are created. If you look at the entire complex, you can normally only see it from the top or on a plan. Actually, even from the top, you will not get a clear view. You need to see a line drawing of the plan with the various places located in it to really understand it. So many of them are manifestations of mythological spaces. So Angkor Wat, to a large extent, is a manifestation of the Omphalos, or the center of the world, or Mount Meru. Similarly, Borobudur tries to achieve the same thing. And there are many such temples. In fact, probably a more interesting Hindu temple would be Prambanan, if you wanted to see one in that region.
Meena, thank you for a fascinating lecture. And Hina also thank you for a fascinating lecture.
Thank you, everybody. Are there any more questions? I'll be very happy to take them. Please put them in the chat. See, there are so many different sacred spaces. There are sacred spaces that interact with each other. There are sacred spaces that compete with each other. There are completely secular roadways and pathways which become sacred. For those of the people who live in Mumbai, the Chowpatty beach becomes incredibly sacred for 10 days because the Ganpatis find their way there for their immersion into the sea. Similarly, the Juhu beach becomes sacred at that time. So just for the immersion and the sending away of the gods and the goddesses. And then this finds reflection again in Bengal when you have the the coming of the Devi on Shashti, and when she leaves on Dashami, once again the spaces where she is taken down to the ghat, then lowered into the waters, those become sacred for that time and that space. So many sacred spaces can be temporary in nature. Many sacred spaces can be at the culmination of an event. so on and so forth. If you look back at the Rig Veda, for example, and the Atharva Veda, and you look at the creation of the mandalas and the fire altars, they are always outside the villages in the towns. And not only do you make them, you destroy them when you finish the ritual. So the space is sacred, it is consecrated, the ritual is carried out, and then that platform and that mandala are destroyed specifically so that they cannot be used for anything ill. You understand? Which is something that archaeologists greatly view, because we cannot find the remains of any of these altars because of these reasons. As it is, they are on the periphery. And then to add to it, it is that much more complicated because they are destroyed. So very, very rarely do we ever find intact fire altars of any Vedic rituals. How about wedding halls? So, Usha ma'am, I completely agree with that also. For the duration of the ceremony, the mandapa, the wedding mandapa itself is a sacred space. For the Janev ceremony, ditto. So, any place where you perform a havan or a ceremony which is religious in nature, automatically that space becomes a sacred space. See, I don't even want to get into this just now because I don't know if Ramesh has got somebody to speak about this, but the kitchen in the house is a sacred space. See, traditionally, the women folk of the family, especially in a Hindu house, will have a bath, say their prayers, and then enter the kitchen early in the morning. Okay, and the kitchen fire is part of the sacred fires. Similarly, for the Zoroastrians, the kitchen fire is the basic sacred fire. So, the kitchen, therefore, is a sacred space. When there is a death in the family, the fires are put out. The family mourns. You don't eat food cooked on your own fire because the the suffering is symbolic of the light going out from your lives because somebody has died. It's very, very simple. It doesn't have to be complicated. And it is only after the Shraddh ceremony traditionally that you relight the fires and you start cooking by yourself, etc., etc. In some places it is 2 days, in some places it is 3 days, in some places 8 days, in some places 20 days. So your friends, your family, your brethren will feed you at this time. So amongst the Zoroastrians also, the traditionally the house fires are banked and put off, and you move to the place adjacent to the Towers of Silence. And then for the 3 days of the ceremonies, you perform those ceremonies there, and you eat food that is brought to you by your relatives. And there are restrictions to what you can eat and what you can't eat, like all Shraddh food has. And very few people realize why Dhansak is never made for happy occasions. It is because at the end of the period of mourning, when all the ceremonies are done and dusted, the first hot meal as such eaten by the entire family is a Dhansak. So yes, so that are very interesting. So it's a very healthy meal. It's got meat in it, it's got vegetables in it, it's got dals in it, it's got spices in it, it's got fried onions in it. So all of it gives you a nice, wholesome, solid meal and puts you back in a good frame of mind. So it's not an unhappy meal, but it's not an auspicious meal.
How are notions of sacred spaces shared between religions? This is from Usha ma'am.
Is this from Usha ma'am or is this from Ramesh sir, who is handling Usha ma'am's this thing?
This is from Ramesh.
So shared spaces very often are spaces that have been taken away, spaces that have been encroached upon. So your Kashi Vishwanath temple and the mosque alongside is a shared space, which has been forcefully shared. There are many other spaces where you will find shrines of different faiths back to back with each other, because those spots are important spots. So this is commonly seen in India, where you will find a mosque and a temple virtually cheek by jowl with each other. You will very rarely also find this with other sacred spaces. So these spaces are then shared. Very often tanks are shared. So within the religion, within the faith also they can be. So for example, the Mumbadevi temple, when the Mumbadevi temple was moved, and there is an incredible controversy about exactly where it was moved from. But when the Mumbadevi temple had to be moved, it was invited by another temple and planted on the side of their kund. So the other temple exists today. The kund on which it was planted is now the backside of Mumbadevi temple and has been filled up and turned into, I think, either a parking lot or a horribly badly maintained garden by the BMC. And the other temple is very little known to everybody because it's a private trust that invited Mumbadevi there. So sacred spaces are very, very often shared and very easily shared. Okay, seashores are very easily shared and they're sacred spaces. I mean, the sea is the largest single sacred space that you will find anywhere. Anybody who lives on the banks of the sea or gets their livelihood from the sea worships the sea. It is the greatest shared sacred space that I know of. Bhaucha Dakka will see Narayana Purnima. Bhaucha Dakka will see the Jewish community gathering there to offer their prayers to the sea. The Marine Drive will see all kinds of faiths, including the immersion of various different deities. And you will have the Parsi gates, which are in the middle of controversy just now, where the Parsis come and worship on Awa Maino, Awa Roj, or just on Awa Roj in any month, which is the day of the month dedicated to the Lady of the Waters, Awa Abdi Surbanu. So very many spaces are shared. It is very often we don't even realize that we're sharing a space.
There are a couple of compliments. Devendra Kaur, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful start to the series. Jolly Shankar says, thanks for very refreshing lecture. Amla Nevalkar, thank you so much, sir. Simply wonderful. Shubham Patil, thank you for the wonderful knowledge, sir.
See, there are, as I keep saying, there are multiple levels of sacred spaces. And there are multiple spaces that were sacred, which have become profane. There are profane places which are made sacred. So one of the great sacred spaces of the world is the island of Ireland. So the island of Ireland was run amok by snakes and all kinds of other creatures like that, and was a profane place. And then good old Saint Patrick came there and he slammed his staff into the ground and he chased all the snakes from Ireland. And well, actually, there are no Irish snakes. Yeah, the only snakes in Ireland are politicians, but that's another story for another day. So what I'm trying to get at here is that, yes, so then the whole of Ireland becomes sacred because he has done away with the profane. And was one of the arguments actually made for not lifting the ban on abortion in Ireland for the longest time ever. The Dome of the Rock at Al-Aqsa, in Jerusalem, is one of the other great sacred spaces which is shared.
Okay, I request the audience to put any question that I may have missed because I had a few moments of internet outage in between. So in case I've inadvertently missed it, please do put it on the chat again, and apologies for the inconvenience. I'm just saying that because I wouldn't really know if I missed out on any question otherwise. Please do put it on the chat again. Request you if I have missed any question from anyone.
What about your question? You're usually brimming with a few.
No, today I did not ask because I usually ask my questions after attending and after reading a few things. Then the questions start coming. So since I'm still very new in this topic, I'm just humbly absorbing. The questions will come 2 months later.
Venkatesh, so many spaces that you would consider to be completely mundane and profane can be sacred. So, for example, the banks. Okay. And I mean, I'm not saying money is our religion and that kind of thing. But when a puja is done in a bank, is that a sacred space? When a puja is done in a school, is it a sacred space? When a marriage is performed in a college quadrangle, does that become a sacred space? So many of our colleges might be Jesuit colleges or Hindu colleges or Jain colleges, which will have some kind of a shrine or the other in them. Are they then, as Indians, every single place of learning is a shrine? Remember, we have a goddess of knowledge. Every single religious place, every single place of learning is a religious place and a sacred space by that nature itself. So it all depends on where you want to take the concept of a sacred space.
Dr. Kelkar's question, this is the one. So would it be University of the School be one of the most sacred spaces? So one you answered.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And Ridhi's question as to what is the notion behind using the same space as a sacred space across religions?
See, what happens is, Riddhi, there is an entire notion of sacredness that a space acquires. Even after that space, now in the case of Mandapeshwar, it seems that Mandapeshwar may have been a living monument when the Portuguese took it over. We're not very sure about that. But what we do know is that there is a sense of continuity. So I'll give you a great example of this. When I go to Osmanabad every year for my field trip that I do with my students in Diwali, which I sadly missed last year for the first time in 11 years, thanks to COVID. We stop at a place called Vadgaon, where there is a beautiful brick stupa. It's one of the few freestanding brick stupas in India. Sadly, in the Deccan, and sadly, it's not a protected monument. So the Vadgaon stupa now has a temple that has been built on top of it. A beautiful cement concrete platform was built on top of the Vadgaon stupa. Then cement stairs led up to it. Then a shikhara was added to it. Then it was painted. Then a fence appeared around the stupa. Now there is a small set of guest houses that are being built alongside it. So the entire archaeological site is being reused. Why is it being reused? Because there is a certain sacred nature to that location. Even after the people using it for that specific purpose have departed from that space, the sacred nature of that space remains intact in the collective memory of the people who live around it. And this is something that is very, very commonly seen. So you will see a lot of old Jain sites and Buddhist sites and even Brahmanical sites being reused, reconverted, and so on and so forth. The Dharashiv caves are a fascinating example of Buddhist caves, which were in a pass and therefore in a very important location. And alongside which, in the Maratha period, you have the building of a beautiful shrine alongside it in the late Peshwa style. And then in the modern period, you have the Jains coming there and seeing this beautiful image of Muchalinda Buddha and saying, "Arey, Muchalinda Buddha is none other than this thing. अपना क्या बोलते हैं that Muchalinda Buddha is none other than Parshvanath, and therefore this has to be an older Jain shrine. So they convert that shrine into a Jain shrine. So it is not that anybody is trying to take over somebody else's sacred space or something like that. Very often it can be very, very segued into it. So, we've been going on and on about the Babri Masjid being built on top of a temple. And this is Ram Janma Bhoomi. And a lot of people would probably like me bringing this up. But the reality is archaeologists have never denied the fact that there is a temple underneath. There's always been a temple there. The whole point was the temple destroyed to build the mosque. There is no evidence of this whatsoever, number one. Number two, the entire question of Ayodhya and Ram Janmabhoomi for that location is a story that comes up only in the Gupta period. Before the Gupta period, this location is not known as Ayodhya and is not linked to Lord Rama. So if this is the case, and this is something that has come about later, then as far as archaeologists are concerned, this cannot be Ram Janmabhoomi. In fact, this location was very, very famous as a place of Jain pilgrimage and had a very famous temple built to Lord Adinatha or Rishabhnath originally, and that is why this location was so famous. It just happened to be at a very good location, and it got appropriated and became the Ram Janmabhoomi. Not to mention that the Ram Janmabhoomi Masjid is on the outskirts of the modern town, which again is a medieval town, and that itself would say that, why would the important Ram Janmabhoomi have been on the outskirts of anything? Are there any other questions?
No, the last one was from Dr. Shankar. So that's the last question. We would encourage and request all to please join the series and please endeavor to join tonight itself because last moment enrollments are always a bit inconvenient and we don't want to miss anyone in communication and all the back end work. So we encourage and request all participants to please enroll well on time. We kind of look forward to having you all in this mega series. It's I'm particularly looking forward to it. There never has been a series like this put together ever before. I think this is just going to be fabulous.
Who wishes to join only a single lecture is free to do so on the payment of rupees 500. So if you want only to listen to Ramya or you only want to listen to Usha ma'am or to Devinder Bhasin or any of our 12 lecturers, you're welcome. However, if you try to do this, the retail price will come to 6,000 rupees. So ask you to take the package deal at 4,000, which gives you a hefty 33.33% discount. Okay, but nevertheless, if you would like to take only a single lecture, you're free to do so. All our bank details, everything remains the same. You just need to pay 500 and indicate which lecture you wish to, and you can do that. But we hope to see you all tomorrow in the first of our series, in which Ervad Ramyar Karanjia will take you through all the Zoroastrian sacred spaces, how they have evolved, places of worship, as well as places of death and memorial. So with that, we will call it a day. Enormous thanks to Dr. Dalal. He not only gave such a fabulous lecture today, which is a habit of his, of course, but my very personal thanks for having introduced me to this field and to look at it from various perspectives. And yeah, to not only look at a place of religion as somewhere I was dragged to by parents and grandparents, as thinking of it as a waste of time. But over time, I've now come to see them through their geographies, through their architecture, through art, and ultimately to the many hundreds of ways in which people use these shrines. Something that was not mentioned was the very profane uses of sacred spaces. I remember which is the shrine, sir, next to Ter, where you took us? Sir?
Yeah.
The shrine next to Ter.
Upli.
Yes, sir?
Upla temple.
No, not Upla. The one we used to go to usually in the evening after Ter.
The water tank at the back. Even I can't remember the name of it.
A medieval temple which is touched up by the Marathas.
Like it's a Lakshmi temple, and So many of these temples. So that's the Uple temple, the medieval temple that was touched up by the Marathas. Then there's Mankeshwar also, which is similarly reinvigorated. So this also keeps happening, Ramesh, and it's very easy to say that the Marathas were Hindus and the Chalukyas were Hindus, and therefore it is the same thing. It's not the same thing. Very often, even the main deity in the sanctum gets changed. So de facto, it's a brand new temple. And it is again the sacred nature of that shrine which keeps it going. I still remember the first time we did something like this together. Ramesh and I worked on the Jews, the Bene Israeli Jews, and we published a beautiful paper. I think it was Ramesh's first foray into sacred spaces, and then he subsequently become quite the expert on the sacred spaces of the Jews. And it's been a beautiful journey to see people on. So I keep saying that cast your net wide, and the more you learn and the more you listen to and the more you talk about and the more you write about and the more you read about, is one amazing journey and makes life worth it.
Right. But what I noted was at the temple, how the people used it also as their community gathering spot, of how young children used the courtyard to play in. Grains and other things were being dried in the temple premises. We saw lots of old grindstones. So very often then there is, I think, the sacred becomes part of the profane, and the profane becomes part of the sacred in ways that make life bearable. Like,
Yeah, but it spills over so easily, no? And then there are such interesting stories that come out of it, Ramesh. I remember at the place that you are named after, Rameshwaram, there was this
yes,
amazing story that all the problems that took place in Sri Lanka basically happened because of a misalignment of the Gopuram entrance at Rameshwaram. You see, Rameshwaram is Dakshinamurti Shiva, with his face turned towards the south. So the opening of the sanctum is towards the south, and the gaze of the Lord falls upon Sri Lanka, and therefore Sri Lanka is a happy island. And there was a major tsunami, and there was damage to the Gopuram, and the Gopuram was realigned by mistake when the gateway was realigned by mistake when they rebuilt it. And the gaze of the Lord no longer fell directly out in a straight line out of his temple onto Sri Lanka. And that Sri Lanka suffered because of this mistake. That the entire crisis in Sri Lanka was just because of a misalignment of this sacred axis. The sacred axis of Rameshwaram, which had ensured peace and tranquility in Sri Lanka, had been destroyed. And therefore, Sri Lanka had the troubles it did. It is such a fascinating way of explaining a geopolitical situation.
there's a follow-up story because the Gopuram was structurally unsound and had to be demolished and was later rebuilt. And this time the gaze fell on Sri Lanka. You would know that, right across the strait, on when you touch landfall at Sri Lanka, is Tiruketeshwaram, and there's
Yes.
the temple of that Lord there, who's also Shiva.
Yes.
So the two basically act as maybe gatekeepers to the Park Strait. But the saying goes that once the Gopuram was rebuilt and realigned, the troubles in Sri Lanka,
Yes. Completely fizzled out.
yeah,
Because now the gaze of the Lord fell again. The conduit had been rebuilt. And well, it did stop. So, for those who believe, this was a great moment of faith.
true. So thank you very much. We will look forward to an intriguing 12 Saturdays of the very many ways in which the sacred interacts with us, the many geographies of the sacred. And with that, now I must call it a day. Otherwise, now my parents will butcher me for delaying their dinner. And I'm sure everybody else's parents, wives, children are expecting them to be back in the bosoms of their families. So this temporary sacred space that happens over Zoom must now be shut. And we will see you all in the afternoon tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yes, Sachin, there will be a recording.